our workshop series under Meta Plus 2.0, organized by the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Club of the University of Colombo, in collaboration with the Leo Club of the University of Colombo Faculty of Science. My name is Maneka Jayasinghe, and I will be your host for the evening. And it is with great pride that we bring out Meta Plus 2.0, which is being held for the second consecutive year after the successful accomplishment of Meta Plus 1.0, which was completed spectacularly on the theme of digital media marketing. However, we will advance this year by illuminating Sri Lankan undergraduates on the theme of research and innovation in tandem with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Meta Plus 2.0 will be completed in 3 phases, where the first phase is comprised of enlightening workshops for undergraduates around the country. And the second phase will be a carefully curated video series corresponding to the United Nations SDGs, and we will conclude our project with the grandest and the final third phase, which will be a competition for all the young entrepreneurs in Sri Lanka, national and in private universities. The competition guidelines and more information will be shared at the end of this month, so do stay tuned. And now we shall commence today's workshop based on the introduction research. To guide you on your journey as a scholar in tomorrow's world, we have a distinguished alumnus from the University of Colombo, who is none other than Dr. Maneka Jayasinghe. Dr. Maneka Jayasinghe currently works at the College of Business and Law at the Charles Darwin University of Australia as the Head of Business and Accounting and as a Senior Lecturer in Economics at the Faculty of Arts and Science. She is an applied economist, and her research areas vary from feminist economics to consumer demand analysis, poverty and well-being, energy economics, and tourism analysis. She is the best influence for all the budding innovators here. And after her session, we would have the Q&A session, which will be held, and you may direct your answers to Dr. Maneka Jayasinghe through the chat box. Dear Madam, you can address the gathering.
Thank you, Dehemi. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to give a talk in your research workshop series. I'm sure all of you are here this evening because you are quite keen to understand the research processes and aiming to complete your thesis and or some research papers in the near future. Doing research is very interesting. Once you are very much into research, you may not even want to choose any other else as your career. It is addictive in a way. However, doing research is challenging, and particularly for students who are yet to start the process, it is even more challenging because there are lots of things involved in carrying out a research successfully. Hopefully, this workshop will clarify some of the doubts you may have regarding how to start a research project and what are some basic things you should know when starting a research project. Now, I'm going to share my screen. Just let me know whether you can see it. Can you see it?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Okay. We are going to start our discussion about how to start this research process. So as requested, my presentation will cover the areas such as how to understand the current research landscape and identify gaps in knowledge, how to define the aims and objectives of the research project, how to develop research hypotheses, and how to develop a research proposal. So when you are interested in doing research, you get many excellent ideas because you can be fascinated by many unanswered or unclear questions. And as researchers, you are always curious to seek answers for questions such as why and how. These ideas you get are mainly linked to your academic discipline. For example, social sciences, STEM, that is science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, or medicine, etc. Once you have decided on the broad discipline area within which you want to situate your research, the next step is to turn your research idea into a precisely defined
Excuse me, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am. I'm sorry for interrupting, but actually we cannot see the screen from now on. Like it just says you started screen sharing.
Yeah.
But it doesn't show the slides though.
Oh, is that right? Okay, let me see. Can you see now?
Not exactly, ma'am.
1 second. I'll just stop sharing once again and try it.
Yes, now it's visible.
Can you see now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Sorry about that.
No worries.
And in slideshow mode also, can you see now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, so I was talking about how to turn a researchable idea into a research project. So once you have decided on the broad discipline area within which you want to situate your research, the next step is to turn your research idea into a precisely defined research project. Now, the key to this is the focus. What exactly you want to do or what exactly you want to research. Often students come up with research ideas that are way too ambitious because you want to do everything you would like to do, but sometimes it's not possible. You may not have the capacity to complete the project. The knowledge-wise, the finances-wise, the time-wise, it may be impossible to undertake an very ambitious project. Therefore, it is important to keep in mind that all great ideas you have may not possibly be undertaken or completed as a research. Therefore, it's important to clarify whether the project you want to do is a researchable project at the beginning. There is this simple test you can use to test whether your project is researchable. It's all about the resources you have to undertake the project. The time required to conduct the research. To design the project, carry out the field work, analyze the data, write up your findings, draw conclusions, and make recommendations, you or your team need time. The money required to conduct the research. Usually, even very small scale research projects, you need some sort of funding to conduct the fieldwork or access data. Likewise, access to data is an important element in your research because data is the backbone of a research project. We can't underestimate the difficulties we encounter in accessing data, irrespective of whether you collect your own data or access secondary data. So it is important to make sure that you as a researcher have these resources from the start and for the duration of the project. As undergraduate students, you may spend about 6 to 10 months completing the project, depending on your discipline and the duration of the data collection time frame, etc. As students, you may not have access to huge budgets, and hence it's important to think about all possible expenses that you may incur during your project and incorporate such constraints into your research design. Now, let's assume that you have a researchable project and where to go from here. So, research project should emerge from the literature of the area or the field within which your research project is situated. And ultimately, your project should make a contribution to the literature and theory in that field. In order to develop an understanding of the kind of research being carried out in your field and the focus of those research and any research gaps in the literature, where little or no research has been carried out, or whether there are any unanswered questions, you have to read the existing literature carefully to understand these sort of things. A gap in the research means that there is a need for research in this area, and it would be a very good idea to develop your project as a response to such a gap. So what is literature? Literature is research that has already been carried out and published. Literature review is an important step in any research process. Without doing a literature review, it's almost impossible to formulate a very good research project. The existing research may have been published in journal, may have published as journal articles, books, theses, reports published by governments, NGOs, and other research institutes, or conference papers. All of these are existing literature. The literature in a field of research constitutes the body of knowledge in that field. It also contains the theory in that field. The researcher undertakes a review of the literature in order to develop expertise in the area or on the topic, establish what is known and what is unknown in the field, highlight the gaps in the knowledge base in the area. The researcher may decide to use their research project to try to fill in one or more of these gaps. And you can also create a theoretical framework for your research project if you, after you do your literature review. In addition, you can also identify suitable methodology to carry out your research project by doing a comprehensive literature review. So, when you read the literature, you have to read it in such a way to that at the end, you can answer some of these questions. If you can answer all of these questions, that's really good. But at least you should be able to answer as much as these questions. Is there anything written about this issue or topic, the issue or the topic that you are interested in researching? You may find lots of research has already been done, or little research or no research at all done in that area. If no research at all, it may sound exciting because you can make a substantial contribution to the literature. But no research at all means that there may be significant risks associated with proceeding with that topic. So you need to be a bit careful. Where is the topic being written about, such as journal articles, books, reports, etc. If the topic has been written about in the journals, this is really good. Journals in the sense, the peer-reviewed journals I'm talking about, right? Sometimes people call them as index journals, but also there are globally, internationally recognized list of good journals. So if the papers you are selecting or the research you are looking at are published in that sort of really good journals, it's quite good, because this means that the topic has been addressed and developed theoretically. And then you also need to look at who has been writing on this topic, which countries those researchers are based on, when did they write, recently or long time ago. If it's long time ago, it may imply that your research is a bit outdated due to changes in the knowledge, changes in technology, etc. Sometimes very recent topics may not have enough literature for a student to get familiarized with the topic. On the other hand, the recent studies also imply that the topic is emerging and hence may capture lots of interest in the scientific field. So you need to be aware of all these aspects when you do your literature review. And you also need to focus on what are the authors of those journal articles saying about the topic, what is known about the topic, what issues and aspects have been thoroughly explored, and what issues, aspects, and questions do the authors of the journal articles recommend for further or future research. Any issues are yet to be explored. In most of the published research, they talk about future research areas or highlight limitation of the current research. Is there any issue among those issues that you would, could, or should explore in your research project? For example, can you address a limitation in another study and improve that research further? That will be a good contribution. And it'll fill a significant gap in the literature as well. So if you do take some time to answer these questions, it is very likely that you will develop a sophisticated understanding of your idea for your research project. Now, over the years, numerous types of literature reviews have emerged. But the four main types are traditional or narrative literature review, systematic literature review, meta-analysis, and meta-synthesis literature review. So if you look at the traditional or narrative literature review, the primary purpose of this type of literature review is to analyze and summarize a body of literature. This is achieved by presenting a comprehensive background of the literature within the interested topic to highlight new research streams. There is no well-defined way of finding relevant literature. You may use various techniques such as backward and forward reference search. Systematic literature review. As the name says, systematic literature review undertakes a more rigorous and systematic approach to reviewing the literature and answers highly structured and specific research questions. Meta-analysis takes the findings from chosen literature and analyzes these findings by using standardized statistical procedures. Meta-analysis method help in drawing conclusions and detecting patterns and relationship between findings. Meta-synthesis is a non-statistical procedure. It evaluates and analyzes findings from qualitative studies and aims to build on previous conceptualizations and interpretations. As a researcher, you decide what type of literature review you do. At undergraduate level, the traditional or narrative literature review is quite common, but may vary based on your discipline. And I recommend you to have a conversation with your supervisor in terms of what is the best way to do your literature review. So, when you have decided on the broad area within which you wish to situate your research project, and have a reasonable understanding of the current literature and gaps in the literature, the next step is to develop a simple research statement that clearly expresses your idea for your research project. Before you started your literature review, you may have had a rough idea about your research statement, but you can always refine it once you gain better understanding of the literature. So I have just given here one example based on my own research. The research statement in one of my projects was, this research examines the energy poverty in Sri Lanka. This can be a very simple research statement. Once the research statement has been defined clearly, the next step is the development of the research aim and objectives from the research statement. The simplest way to do this is to develop one aim and a series of objectives. The aim is a precise statement of what the researcher intends to accomplish with the research. The research aim describes the main goal or the overarching purpose of your research project. So from my previous research statement, I can come up with an overarching aim for my research as, the aim of this research is to examine the energy poverty in Sri Lanka. The next thing we need to figure out is the objectives. Objectives are the steps the researcher intends to take in order to accomplish the aim of the research. For example, the objective of my research was to examine the level and intensity of energy poverty in Sri Lanka, to investigate the inequality in energy poverty in Sri Lanka, to examine whether the income poor are also energy poor, and to identify socio-economic and demographic determinants of energy poverty in Sri Lanka. So the tip here is, it is recommended that you have one aim and maximum of 6 research objectives. In some disciplines, research objectives are presented as research questions. We can simply convert the research objectives to more specific research questions. See what how I have converted my objectives to questions here. Instead of to examine the level of intensity, I have changed it to, what is the level and intensity of energy poverty in Sri Lanka? What is the extent of inequality in energy poverty in Sri Lanka? Are the income poor also energy poor? What are the socio-economic and demographic determinants of energy poverty in Sri Lanka? So you can see that research questions are basically the research objectives converted into question format. Another important aspect in scientific research is to develop research hypotheses. If you are very much familiar with the literature, you can easily develop your hypothesis. Hypotheses are predicted answers based on your knowledge gained through the review of the literature. Hypotheses are empirically testable using statistical data analysis techniques, and we try to prove or disprove a hypothesis based on the evidence we get in our analysis, or we conclude whether our data support our hypothesis. So let's look at how to develop research hypotheses when you have already defined research objectives or research questions. See, for example, some hypotheses I have taken from one of my publications. So the research objective, to examine whether an increase in GDP, that is gross domestic product, increases tourism. I can convert that into a research question as, does an increase in GDP increases tourism? And also, I can convert it to a hypothesis as, increase in GDP increases tourism. Right? So I developed this hypothesis based on the existing theory, which I found after a thorough review of literature. And the theory is the economy-led tourism hypothesis. So that's why it's important that you have a very good understanding about the literature before you come up with your hypothesis. Take another example. Now, the second research objective is to investigate whether tourism positively contributes to GDP. And I can convert that to a research question. Does tourism positively contribute to GDP? And the hypothesis is tourism positively contributes to GDP. Again, I developed this hypothesis based on the well-known tourism-led growth hypothesis in the literature. Similarly, you can see how I have converted research objectives to research questions and to hypotheses in the next two examples as well. Always, hypotheses are based on existing knowledge, and in your research, you will see whether you have enough statistical evidence to support that hypothesis. So when you have a hypothesis in your research, you also have to define what is the null and what is the alternative hypothesis upfront. For example, my hypothesis is increase in GDP increases tourism. Now my null hypothesis is increase in GDP does not increase tourism. And my alternative hypothesis is increase in GDP increases tourism. So after we analyze data, we should be able to make a conclusion whether we reject the null hypothesis in favor of the alternative hypothesis or do not reject the null hypothesis. Based on your findings, you can make recommendations. So now you have some understanding about key aspects in the research process. Let's look at the key elements of a research proposal. Preparation of a research proposal forces you to think carefully about each stage of the research process. Let's go step by step. Background of the research. You start the research proposal by giving an explanation about the background of the research. Of course, just because you have to do a research to complete your degree is not a good enough explanation to conduct your research. You have to explain why you selected a particular research topic and why it is important to conduct your research. What are the theoretical, empirical, and practical or policy implications of your research? Sometimes you may not have all three types of implications. That's okay. Maybe you are working on a theory paper or theory project, so you will only have a theoretical contribution. Maybe you are working on an empirical or applied work, applied research, so you will only have empirical contribution. Or you can actually inform the policy through an empirical contribution. So look at your research and see what sort of contributions you can make and incorporate that in the background to highlight why this is important, why someone should spend money on this research, why someone should spend time on this research, and also why someone should read this research once obviously it is published. Here I have given an example from my own research, which is about energy poverty in Sri Lanka. Why I decided to do research on energy poverty in Sri Lanka. So I go on explaining because the measurement of energy poverty of households have largely been missing or inaccurate, especially for developing countries. But accurate information on the extent and depth of energy poverty has the potential to positively influence the design of policy. So I highlight the importance of doing or analyzing or measuring the energy poverty. I also continue to say that Sri Lanka still faces major development challenges, including providing affordable, accessible, and reliable energy services and reducing poverty and regional disparities. However, measurement of the extent and depth of energy poverty in Sri Lanka are generally absent, and the research and discussion of energy poverty are largely missing in the policy and public domain in Sri Lanka. So I highlight the current situation as a background to my research to highlight why I am doing this. So next step is the research statement, and then next aims and objectives. We already discussed about it. In the aims and objectives section, you can also talk about your research questions or research hypothesis, depending on your discipline area. Read the literature in your discipline area, so you will then understand whether they present aims and objectives or research questions or research hypothesis. In the next section, you can talk about the literature review, right? Substantial proportion of your proposal will be on literature review. Once you have summarized the existing literature in the literature review, you also need to emphasize the gaps in the literature you found and how does your proposed research will contribute to addressing this gap. Research methodology is another important component. In your research, you have to follow a methodology backed by the literature again. So when you do the literature review, pay special attention to the research methodologies that have been used in those studies. And most probably you will use one of those methodologies in your research as well. You can also make methodological contribution to research by improving the methodology of existing research with better methodologies. For this, you need to have a very good understanding of the research topic as well as various research methodologies. And then next important component is data. As I said earlier, data is an essential item of your research. If you don't have data, there's no research. Now, you can either collect your own data, which is challenging, time-consuming, and costly, but also you can use data collected by other institutions or other people or other specially dedicated research data collection institutions. For example, the Census and Statistics Department in Sri Lanka. Either way, it's fine as long as it serves your purpose and the data is accurate. If you use primary data, you have to, primary data in the sense, if you collect your own data, you have to provide a detailed explanation of sampling techniques, sample size, how you decided your sample size, reliability of your sample and the responses, survey methods, etc. You have to say it very clearly, very precisely, because the sampling aspect can be highly questioned in your thesis. Even if you submit it to a journal, people question about your sampling because all what you recommend at the end will be dependent on how good your sample was, right? If you plan to use secondary data, again, you have to discuss how you are going to obtain your data. What are the potential limitations of the data? Because you are dealing with data collected by somebody else. So you may not have the exact variables that you want to use. So in that case, what is your plan? What are the proxy variables that you are going to use? And how scientifically or methodologically viable to use those proxies? Have other people use those variables as proxies? So you need to find all these and document very well in the description of data sources section in your proposal. And another important aspect, you may want to briefly touch on research ethics in your proposal. It is even more important if you do a primary data collection and it involves animal and human interactions. You may need to obtain animal and human ethics approval prior to doing your field work. You have to check with your university or with your supervisor how to get these approvals, or whether you need that sort of approvals before you start your research. And then also you need to mention the context of the research. Very briefly, somewhere in the proposal, you have to mention that you are undertaking this research as a part of your whatever the degree program. Plagiarism is a serious offense in research, even in your assignments. I hope you are aware of that. So you have to acknowledge all the sources of references that you refer in compiling your document. You can use a referencing software to generate your reference list, which is quite easy way of doing the reference list rather than you doing it manually. You need to check with the referencing style recommended by your university or in your discipline. EndNote is a paid software you can use to generate your reference list, and I know Zotero some students are using because it's free software. Even the Word has referencing tool. So if you get used to that, that will save a lot of your time. Last but not least, the presentation of your proposal is also important. It should be free of mistakes as much as possible. You have to read it few times. If you are not comfortable in writing in another language or English language, get it edited by a professional editor or give it to a friend of yours. Ask them to read it. If someone in your home, your family member can read your proposal and give you feedback and make some corrections, it's really good to get it read by many people as much as possible. You need to pay a special attention to formatting. It should be consistent throughout the document. That is an important part of presentation as well. A genuine question that may come into your mind is how long the research proposal should be. Well, it depends on your purpose and requirements. A very concise research proposal can be written in 3 pages as well, but it's very tricky to write such a short research proposal. So most common length is 10 pages. Again, maybe different based on the disciplines. So I recommend you check with your supervisor or lecturer regarding what is the expected length and develop your proposal accordingly. So that's the end of my presentation. And I'm happy to accept any questions from you.
Thank you, madam. Kindly remain with us for the Q&A session. So to begin with, everyone, you may drop in your questions to the chat box. So, ma'am, one of the some of them have directed the question. So, one of the questions would be, what data collection methods will be used normally for research?
Okay, so it again depends on the discipline. In my discipline, which is social sciences, mostly we use surveys. Like we do the interviews, we can do face-to-face interviews, or we can do telephone interviews, questionnaires. Like we can post a questionnaire and get the responses. Yeah, that's the most common way of getting data. But in addition to that, you can also do experiments, which of course you will do in a control setting in a lab. So it really depends on the discipline area. Surveys are the most common method to collect data.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ma'am. That was a very informative answer. So our next question would be, what do you simply mean by a data analysis plan?
Data analysis plan in the sense, so you can do basically a quantitative research or qualitative research. In there, you collect your data, right? But irrespective of the method of your research, that is quantitative or qualitative, you will have data. So once you obtain data, if you are using a quantitative research methods, then you have to select the sort of techniques that you are going to analyze your data. It can, if I talk about, I'm a quantitative person, so I can talk a little bit more about quantitative research. So in quantitative research, you have two types actually. One is the descriptive analysis. The other one is the inferential analysis part. In the descriptive one, you can basically use some of the basic descriptive data analysis techniques, like you can use the graphs and the basic central tendency measures, etc. But the inferential component, it uses the sample data to make inferences about the population parameters. So that's when the hypothesis testing and the regression analysis, that sort of things come into effect. So you can use any of those research techniques to analyze your data, the data you collected. So that constitutes the research data analysis plan. I'm sorry, I'm not that much of a qualitative person to explain lot of qualitative techniques, but I'm pretty sure that in qualitative research also I know people do text analysis, content analysis, that sort of one. So that particular technique, the way you are going to analyze your data, that's the plan for data analysis.
Thank you, madam, for that wonderful answer. And one of the other questions that was dropped by was, can we get an overview of the potential biases and the limitations of the research?
Right. So the biases can happen in terms of data collection. So So when you select a sample, the sample can be biased. Like a good example I can give you is, again, I'm drawing from social sciences because my background is economics. I'm sorry that I can't relate to other areas, but imagine that if I want to do a research on some socio-economic status related study, and I choose to do telephone interviews. By doing that, upfront I exclude a set of respondents, potential respondents who do not have telephones. But then my whole research is about socioeconomic status, where not having a telephone itself is a problem, right? So in that sense, my data collection technique of telephone interviews can give me biased responses. Right, so that's one type of bias. And then if you select only if you want to do a study about entire Sri Lanka, but you use the Colombo district only for data collection, that's definitely a biased sample because Colombo district, socio-economic, demographic, all those factors are quite different to rest of Sri Lanka. So that sort of situations also create biases in data collection, which leads to biases in your conclusion as well. Did I answer the question?
Yes,
Was there any
yes.
another part? Sorry, I forgot.
The other part was limitations of the research.
Yeah, so as I said in the beginning, when you come up with a research idea, your idea becomes a researchable project if you have enough money, if you have enough time, and if you have access to data, right? So sometimes, yes, if you do a face-to-face interview, that is the best way to collect data. But unfortunately, you don't have enough money to travel to all the places to go and do that face-to-face interview. As a result, you decide to do a telephone interview. So that's a limitation because you don't have enough financial resources. You change your research plan to a less costly research plan. And then the time wise also, right? If we have 1 year to do our research, if we have 10 years to do the same project, of course, 10-year projects, other than the fact that you get bored when you work on the same project for 10 years, but you have more time. You can read a lot, you can improve your work a lot. But of course, one can't work on a research project for 10 years, right? So as students, most probably you'll have about 6 to 10 months to complete your project. So that is a limitation, definitely. And then if you want to do a really generalizable research, you want to collect data from the population. That is, you need to do a census. So if you, but you know how expensive and how tedious it can be to do a data collection from the population or to do a census. That's why we end up with selecting samples, right? So that is again a limitation because we can't always go for a population. We decide to go for a small sample, which may not be the best possible sample that we can draw. The sample we draw is based on the resources we have. So resource is the main limitation you can highlight in your project.
Thank you, ma'am. And another question that was dropped was, when we normally review literature, what is the maximum year gap that we can consider? For example, should we refer articles written only within the 10 years gap? Or can we use articles that was also written before 10 years?
Right. So now, why 10 years? Like, how did you select that 10 year? That is also questionable. Why not it's 15 years? Why not it's 20 years, right? So when you do research, every single thing that you do, you have to justify. If you decide to select last 10 years, you have to give a reason because what is it? Like, for example, I do some research on sustainable development goals, right? So when I do my literature review, I actually look at the literature after 2015. So I say last 5 years literature. The reason is that before 2015, no one talked about sustainable development goals. Sustainable development goals was introduced in 2015, right? So last like that. Before that, if someone was doing some development related research, it was the Millennium Development Goals that they had to look at. So we can't randomly select 10 years and just go ahead with our literature. So that's number one. Number two, if you do a systematic literature review, we normally see people make that sort of cutoff, like we use last 10 years, because it is systematic literature reviews are done in a very precise manner. So you would see, if you read systematic literature reviews, they say this was the time frame that we selected. But if you do narrative literature review, usually we don't make that sort of cutoff. We do read as much as possible, even very, very old papers. Like in economics, I cite some of the papers written in 1930, 1920, like that. It depends on how important that particular piece of work in your research, rather than when it was published. But then again, depending on the work you are doing, if something is written in 1930s, that may be so much outdated, particularly if you are talking about science or technology related research. So is it really important to look at that old literature, given that it's not relevant anymore? So I know I didn't give you a direct answer, but you need to think about all these possibilities when you decide that cutoff point, or whether you need to have that cutoff point. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely, ma'am. Thank you very much. And another question that was directed to us, one of our fellow graduates wants to do a research on psychology, which is not the course that she is following in her university. And is there any procedure of how she could get a head start on the research?
Right. I think that message is also, I can see that also. So research on psychology, which is not the course I'm following in my university. So, okay, psychology is a big area, right? So first start with narrowing it down to a particular research area, like, for example, psychological well-being, something like that, if you are interested in that area. And then you have to start reading in that area, given that if it's not the course you are studying at the moment, that means you may be very new to that research area. So you have to spend a lot more time on getting yourself familiarized with the vocabulary, terms used, the theories in that area, the research methodology, all that. It is very challenging. It's very challenging to change your track, change your area, basically. After studying something, you want to do research about something else. It's very challenging, but when you are young, you can do it, because otherwise you have to do something in your entire life that you don't like that much. So when you are young is the best time to make that decision and change it. But of course, I would suggest that if you have any lecturers in that particular area where you are interested, go and have a chat with them. And also I suggest that you doing some basic research course or something unit in that area that gives you some theoretical understanding about that area is actually a good starting point.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And before we end the Q&A session, there's one more request, and a student is requesting if we could get the presentation slides. Would that be possible?
Yeah, and Dami, I have one more question here. Could you please explain research methodology with examples? Can I answer that? Is it
Yeah,
late?
sure. Of
No,
course.
right. Yeah, I didn't want to skip that question. Yeah, so research methodology is firstly, whether it's the quantitative research or qualitative research that you want to do. That's one part of research methodology. And in your proposal, if you want to talk in detail about the research methodology, that's actually the sort of techniques that you are going to use in your research. It can be descriptive. Again, I'm talking about quantitative. It can be descriptive data analysis techniques and methods, or inferential sort of methods. Like you can talk about whether you are going to use regression analysis. Even within regression analysis, there are various different types of regression. You can come up with time series regression models, or cross-sectional regression models, etc. So that's the part roughly you will have to cover in your research methodology. When you read literature, you will see there's a separate section in every paper. They talk about data and methodology, or just the research methodology or methods. So that's the section you need to read in articles to get yourself familiarized with the research methodology. Okay?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, ma'am. And let me pass on back to the request. So would you like kindly share it with maybe Sanjan, and we could get the presentation slide?
Yeah, I'll do that. All right, I'll do that, Dami.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much, because that was indeed a very informative session, and I personally learned a lot. So let me take this opportunity to thank you on behalf of the organizing committee for gracing the occasion. We are indeed humbled by your presence here today, for spending your valuable time for the betterment of the earnest youth of Sri Lanka. And I truly believe your words made an immensely positive impact on all of us. And let me also take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the Career Guidance Unit of the University of Colombo, Faculty of Science, for providing consistent guidance throughout. And also, thank you to everyone for being a part of this wonderful occasion. We shall meet again for another informative workshop on February 15th on commercializing research outcomes. And everyone, do remember to connect with our social media platforms for further details. Thank you, and have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Dami.
Thank you, ma'am. Have a good night.
You too.